Hello everyone and welcome to the next review for Heraclitus Fragments by Philip Wheelwright. But before we get into that, I just want to highlight that I'm always trying to review more books, of course, especially ones that I read a while ago. Just as an example, I really want to revisit Whatever Happened to Tradition by Tim Stanley, very timely book. And just as another example, a book I read quite recently, finished quite recently, Gaston Bachelard's The Poetics of Space. And in terms of fiction, I suppose somewhere up there's Blood in the Mist, there is by Hope Marlees, there is Fantastes by George MacDonald, all sorts of books I want to review. But for now, I'm going to finish what I'm considering to be somewhat of a series of 3 reviews featuring the ideas of Patrick Curry, who is admittedly quite frequently featured on this channel. And this is the 3rd book, the other 2 being The Door on the Wall and the book on John Ruskin. I'd always known about Heraclitus vaguely, his philosophy of change, but I recently visited Patrick Curry at his house. I was very honoured to do so. We spoke about art and enchantment and ecology and so forth, but philosophy came up as well, and Heraclitus featured in our conversation. And so I decided to buy the Philip Wheelwright translation and edition that he recommended. I can see why it's actually quite well reputed, this edition. Heraclitus is very obscure and dark and ambiguous and paradoxical, but the way that Philip Wheelwright writes is really quite is clear, and he's very amiable as well. Quite an enjoyable read. And so this is actually a facsimile of the 1959 edition. There are some markings throughout the text, underlines and things. I believe it went out of print. You see lots of underlines and so forth that are not actually my own. So before I actually get into the book itself, I'm just going to read an extended section just to give a broader overview of the kind of ideas that we're talking about here, from Enchantment, Wonder and Modern Life, essentially the Bible of this channel now, at this point. So the chapter is Technoscience, and the subsection is A Philosophy of Death. The roots of techno-scientific naturalism and scientism lie further back than the scientific revolution. There are principally 2. The obvious one is Christian monotheism, whose commitment to a single universal truth we have already discussed. As modern science developed, the material version of truth eventually replaced God. Scientific laws replaced revelation, and technicians replaced theologians, but the underlying mode was left intact. So too was Christianity's antagonistic energy as a counter-religion to the human religious default, if you'll pardon the metaphor, of animism. Secular scientific naturalists have long attacked their opponents as superstitious, but they took the insult from Protestants attacking Catholics as pagan. It was no great stretch. The second route is classical Greek philosophy. Plato was strongly influenced by the earlier philosopher Parmenides, who had made a radical distinction between being, a singular, perfect, unchanging, unmoving world which is disembodied, contextless and unchanging, and the world of becoming, sensuous, fecund and therefore female earth and all its bodily creatures, subject to ceaseless generation, growth, decay and disappearance. He boldly identified being with truth, and therefore with thought. To be and to think are the same thing. That leaves the world we actually know as non-being, which therefore not only doesn't really exist, but cannot even be thought. The resulting imperative is to never stop asking, is this, whatever it may be, true or false? And the effect is to split concrete magic into these 2 halves. The key questions then become epistemological. How do we know what really is? And is there a sure way to distinguish between what is true and therefore is, and what is false and therefore is not? This was the invitation to the so-called scientific method. The consequences for enchantment are dire. Relationality, perspective, ambiguity, liminality are condemned. So is the tensive truth of metaphor, a new 3rd thing resulting from the bridge perceived/thrown between one thing and another. There isn't even a second thing. Ultimately, only one thing, one world, and one truth is allowed. Plato softened the blow slightly by allowing the world of appearances, a limited and derivative reality, as inferior and derivative copies of logos, the real world of ideas. These copies or shadows are the subject of myths, which are believed only by the superstitious masses. In this way he identified mythos, the contrary of logos, with doxa, vulgar popular opinion. Homer was one of his principal targets, Homer being the bust on the shelf there. Another was Heraclitus, who held that everything flows and nothing abides, everything gives way and nothing stays fixed. The resonance with Taoism is striking. The resultant uncertainty was unacceptable to Plato, not least because it brings into question any claims to final authority by a philosophical elite. Logos thus deftly positions the ceaseless change of Heraclitus' flux as illusory ephemera, taken seriously only by the ignorant masses. So Heraclitus is a pre-Socratic philosopher, born in the 6th century BC, and he's really, coming from Ionia, he's really which was a center, kind of a nexus of philosophical insight at the time. He is a descendant of the Milesian school, Thales, the first true philosopher, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. These were philosophers who tried to see the world through underlying causes or structures rather than appeals to pure mythology. They tried to formulate principles. For example, Thales imagined that all was the fundamental stuff of the world is water. Anaximander thought that it was the aperon, the boundless or infinite, and Anaximenes considered that all things were made of air. For Heraclitus, the central symbol of reality was fire, flame, the unceasing change that is at the very core of reality. All things are in constant flow. And of course, some of you will know the Greek saying panta rei, everything flows, and this is kind of a dual symbolism, dual imagery. The changing, unceaseless fire, but also the river that flows. So Heraclitus was fundamentally aware that this is a world of change, of decay. Of course, this highly contrasts with Parmenides' notion of static being with a capital B. But there's also this sense that Heraclitus believes in a kind of underlying harmony. And Heraclitus, and this is a main theme of the book in his fragments, there's always two sides to his philosophical sayings. There's always ambiguity and paradox. There's this ceaseless change. But Heraclitus also believes in kind of an underlying structure or reality, which he called the logos, which is the structure that or the process that underlies this change, continual change. We must attune ourselves to the logos. So it's a slightly different meaning from the more Christian sense of logos, of a kind of a more unchanging, static, the word of God, essentially. And indeed, it actually says somewhere near the end of this book that Heraclitus is at once a pluralist but also a monist. He is deeply pluralistic in his thinking, but is also a monist in the sense that there is some underlying hidden harmony. Another key aspect of the Heraclitean worldview is that everything is in strife. Everything, change comes about through the union of opposites. It's quite Hegelian, as far as I understand it. And through this change, there comes again, that underlying harmony. So there's always kind of a darkness and a light to his thinking. And just on this point about strife, Heraclitus, interestingly, was critical of Homer. He said that in one fragment, fragment 27, Homer was wrong in saying, "Would that strife might perish from amongst gods and men, for if that were to occur, then all things would cease to exist." We can take Heraclitus' point that, again, it is through conflict that all things are changing. It's not necessarily to suggest that chaos reigns. It's that there is this underlying harmony that comes about through change, but humans don't necessarily have the capacity to see this, to understand this harmony. But just I'll bring up Homer in particular, because I was quite confused by this at first, and I think I might still be confused. From what Patrick has said in his book, you might get the sense that there's an alliance between Homer and Heraclitus as against Plato and Parmenides, in that one values, the one side values stories, change, myth, that kind of mode, which is distinct from unchanging being, the one way to truth, the static realm, and so forth. That there's two different. It's quite a caricature, but there's two different modes. But Heraclitus is he repudiates Homer quite a lot throughout this book, and in fact he repudiates Archilochus as well, another poet. And this is in relation to Heraclitus' disdain almost for mythology, and I was quite confused by that, because I think that in my mind Homer should be more allied with Heraclitus. But the point is that Heraclitus was trying to arrive at a more naturalistic view of the world, not relying on anthropomorphic gods. And in that view, he took from Xenophanes. Xenophanes lambasted this idea of the anthropomorphic Olympic deities. And Heraclitus is following in his footsteps, essentially. But still, I would tend to put Homer with Heraclitus for reasons I can't quite get across at the moment. Maybe I'll put a bit of text in to kind of elucidate my point. And so I'm skipping around here quite a bit because it's quite a difficult text to grasp, admittedly, Heraclitus, but hope you forgive me. But on the point about mythology and Homer, and again, there is this notion of individual wisdom versus collective wisdom in this book. Heraclitus believed in the supremacy of individual wisdom over collective wisdom. And again, that suggests to me that he values not mythological wisdom, which is the collected successive wisdom throughout the centuries, throughout the millennia even, as Patrick Curry writes about. And so in that sense, myth is truth. We live mythically and so forth. Don't have the time to get into that just now, but that again seems to strike against Homer, because Heraclitus values individual wisdom. He was a bit of a misanthrope. He lived apart from his community, and that's just another strike against Homer, I suppose. But at the same time, I'm just remembering that Heraclitus did tend to value community. There's some, I can't quite find the passage just now, but Heraclitus is said to see divinity in community, just as the Stoics did. And I made an interesting connection. The Stoics, if you've read the Stoics, Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and so forth, they thought that the human community was divine. A lot of their writings are about participating in community and so forth. And so I bring this up because there's this notion in Heraclitus which I love, where he is always split between two different sides, and I think I feel the same way on a lot of different topics, from philosophy to aesthetics. The whole point about Heraclitus is that there's always more than one way of seeing things. And so I'm skipping around here a little bit again, but on the point of Heraclitus always being at odds with different worldviews and taking from both sides and so forth. I remembered a passage that I just read quite recently. Philip says, "The peculiar difference that marks the fragments of Heraclitus grows out of his refusal to accept either of these two recognized types of explanation." We're talking about the naturalistic way of seeing things and the idealistic way of seeing things. Although his philosophy shows a certain resemblance to both the naturalistic and the transcendental philosophy in particular respects, he is not content to take either a perceptible physical substance or a postulated metaphysical entity as the be-all of existence. That is pure kind of Patrick Curry animistic, relational, ambiguous thinking there. It's very it's against scientific naturalism and romantic supernaturalism to me. That's how I read it, and that's the kind of way that I'm beginning more and more to think about. And I've mentioned this in my enchantment series, in my vlog on animism, in my 2-hour-long thesis video. It's the type of thinking that I'm more and more attaching myself to, and I found many reminiscences, or resonances rather, of that way of thinking throughout this book, and I think that's the main one I want to get across. It's neither purely naturalistic and neither purely transcendental or idealistic. So I think I will finish this discussion, which admittedly has been quite disjointed and erratic. It comes with the nature of discussing Heraclitus, by suggesting that this is not only an important book to read to understand how philosophy used to be in terms of pre-Socratic philosophy, and also just how philosophy began, but it is also important in today's world, in a world that is very much still indebted to or moves through these ideas of the world as being inferior somehow, or we must always try to transcend our limits and so forth. These very big topics that I have discussed on the channel before. Heraclitus is a philosopher to read, to accept change and death and decay, to accept that things aren't always either or. It can be both and. Very metaphorical ways of thinking, and indeed there's a brilliant, I've just opened to this page, this section just now. It's a brilliant discussion by Philip Wheelwright on serious metaphor and serious paradox, as opposed to surface metaphor and surface paradox. The radical metaphoricity that comes with the fragments of Heraclitus. And you will know that if you've watched, you'll know the significance of metaphor to enchantment if you've watched my series on enchantment. I'm not going to go into the weeds of that now, but suffice it to say, for such an obscure philosopher, Heraclitus, and such a hard to get hold of text, this is one of the, again, it's the facsimile of a very old 1959 edition of Heraclitus Fragments. It's so worthwhile to read nowadays. I'm finding that it's got so much relevance to many issues today, and just how much this resonates with me. So that was Heraclitus Fragments. Thanks for watching, everyone. Until next time.